Assalamualaikum and hi to Doctor and fellow friends. Today we are from Group Nasaa. We present the group assignment titled Economic Factors that Influence FDI in Malaysia. Our group members consist of Nurul Naimi, Nur Sabrina, Aisha Atira, Nur Akila and Megat Ali Imran. This is our table of contents which include introduction, literature review, data and methodology, finding, and lastly conclusion and recommendations. Hi, I'm Aisha. We present the introduction. First is background. A foreign direct investment (FDI) is an action of an investor or company to control the ownership in a business by acquiring an interest in a foreign company. FDI can come in many ways such as joint ventures and merger. Factors to be considered when doing the FDI: a country which offers a skilled workforce and with open economies. As FDI is exposed to the international market, company or investor should also consider the economic factors such as GDP, exchange rate, and government regulation as it will affect the investment. Next is problem statement. To investigate the connection between FDI inflows in Malaysia, the factors of FDI inflows are identified. The determinants that have been identified are gross domestic product, GDP, exchange rate, and inflation rate. Therefore, thus FDI has a significant relationship with independent variables which are GDP, exchange rate, and inflation rate. Next is objective. The first objective is to study the relationship between inflation rate and FDI in Malaysia. The second, to examine the relationship between exchange rate and foreign direct investment in Malaysia. And the third, to examine the relationship between GDP and FDI in Malaysia. For contribution of paper, the past studies research was about relationship between FDI and various independent variables separately in other countries, while the study is more about studying specifically the relationship of foreign direct investment between gross domestic product, inflation rate, and exchange rate that focusing on Malaysia.
For the next part, we are going to explain about literature review related with our topic. This literature review will separate into three parts according to each of the objective. This is the literature review for the objective 1, which is the relationship between inflation rate and FDI, based on an article written by Celine Sai in 2019 in which to evaluate the effects of inflation on the investment decision of multinational enterprise or MNE. The results suggest FDI is used as a hedging tool to mitigate the effects of inflation taxes even if there are no formal hedging mechanism. The investment motivations of MNEs depends on the reason for investment, the financing sources of FDI, and the substitutability between factors of production. Finally, this investment smoothing possibility, which is FDI, reduce the real negative effects of inflation. Secondly, the result from the empirical analysis conducted by Kalam Khalid in 2018 show that inflation rate is significantly affecting FDI inflow in Malaysia. However, based on the research conducted by Teh Yi Hong and Dayang Hazdelina Abang Ali in 2020, in which the researcher used multiple linear regression model augmented decay Fuller ADF test, the vector error correction VECM model, Granger causality. The results show that the inflation rate has negative effects on the foreign direct investment in the long run. As a conclusion, it can be seen that there is a relationship between inflation rate and also foreign direct investment or FDI.
Next, I'm going to present about article related to Objective 2, which is exchange rate and foreign direct investment. Based on the OLS finding conducted by Inta Maizura Abdul Rashid and others, the result shows that there is no relationship between both of the exchange rate and FDI in the construction sector in Malaysia. Besides, this result is also supported by an article written by Bruce and others in which the researcher found a strong and significant effect from fixed rate on bilateral FDI flow in developed economy. However, there is no significant effect for developing country. Moreover, to study the relationship between foreign direct investment and exchange rate toward economic growth in Malaysia for the period 1970 to 2021. Roselia Asid and others has used regression model of the autogressive distribute lag model ARDL method to establish the long-run relationship as well as the direction of causation between variables. From this article, we can conclude that there is no significant relationship between exchange rate and foreign direct investment.
Next is GDP and foreign direct investment. Firstly, Muhammad Shahidan bin Sha'ris and the rest article. The relationship in this article is foreign direct investment on real gross domestic product in Malaysia. For the result, the increase in foreign direct investment has positively impact for the Malaysia's economic growth. And next is Tismazami, Mustafa and the rest. The article relationship is find out the measurement of the determinants of economic growth in Malaysia. The result in this article is a significant relationship between all the independent variable which are GDP. And move forward, article from Ha Wai Moon, relationship is FDI and economic growth in Malaysia. The result is obtain include that FDI inflow will contribute to economic growth in Malaysia. And lastly, article from Nur Suhaili Shahruddin, the relationship is determinant of FDI for Malaysia to inform analytical and policy debates. For the result, GDP growth does play the important role in attracting foreign direct investment to this country. So for the conclusion is it can be seen there are significant relationship between GDP and foreign direct investment.
My name is Nur Akila and I will present about the data and methodology. Firstly, for data collection, there are two variables used in this study, in which for independent variables are inflation rate, exchange rate, and GDP, while the dependent variable is foreign direct investment. All data is collected from the World Bank Open Data website. Furthermore, all data are collected from the year 1982 to 2020 to examine which independent variables affect the dependent variables. Therefore, for data analysis, our group has chose first descriptive statistics, second Pearson coefficient correlation, and third is multiple regression analysis. Next, I will present about the findings for descriptive statistics. Based on the result of descriptive statistics, we can measure the central tendency of the data by looking at the mean and median, in which we can see that from the table, the independent variables that have the highest mean and median is GDP, which is 5.48, and for median is 5.87, while inflation rate has the lowest mean and median of 2.71 and 2.64. Based on the results of descriptive statistics, we can also measure the dispersion of the data by looking at the standard deviation value. A high standard deviation shows that the data is widely spread, which indicates the data is less reliable, and a low standard deviation shows that the data are clustered closely around the mean, which indicates that the data is more reliable. Based on the results, GDP growth has the highest standard deviation of 3.93, while exchange rate has the lowest standard deviation of 0.64. Lastly, based on the results of descriptive statistics, we can also measure normality of the data by looking at skewness and kurtosis value. Based on the table, we can see that FDI, exchange rate, and inflation rate has positively skewed because the value of skewness is more than 0. But for GDP, has negatively skewed because the value of skewness is less than 0, which is negative 1.627. While for kurtosis, the results showed that FDI and exchange rate have plateaued curve because the value of kurtosis is less than 3. But for independent variables, which are inflation rate and GDP, have leptokurtic curves because the value of kurtosis is higher than 3.
The first objective is to determine relationship between foreign direct investment and inflation rate in Malaysia. Based on the table, the relationship between inflation rate and FDI indicates that there is a positive linear relationship of moderate strength between inflation rate and FDI with R value equal to the 0.546. Meanwhile, the two-tail significance value, which is the probability value, is 0.000. This means that our correlation is highly significant. From this analysis, we can conclude that when the FDI increase, the inflation also increase. Our second objective, which is to identify the relationship between foreign direct investment and exchange rate in Malaysia based on the result for correlation analysis, the relationship between the variable is a negative correlation with negative 0.378. According to the two tail significance value in this table are less than 0.05. This indicates that there is a statistically significant correlation between FDI and exchange rate. So based on this analysis, we can conclude that when the FDI increase, the exchange rate decrease. For the third objective, based on the table, the Pearson correlation relationship between GDP growth and FDI is positive moderate correlation with 0.608. Meanwhile, the two-test significance value, which is the probability value, is 0.000. This means that our correlation is highly significant. From this analysis, we can conclude that when the FDI increase, the GDP growth also increase. In conclusion, the result shows that all the variables are significantly correlated between variables because of the two-tail significance value, which is probability value, is less than 0.05. The highest correlation is between GDP growth and FDI. From the result of the correlation matrix table above, there is no multi-collinearity disclosed in all dependence variables that have been selected for the study. Therefore, multiple linear regression model results are meaningful and there is no spurious regression in this research paper.
Next, I'm going to present about finding on multiple regression analysis. R value or multiple correlation coefficient in model summary show the correlation between the foreign direct investment and the independent variable, which are inflation rate, exchange rate, and growth of domestic product. In this case, the value is 0.713, which is greater than 0.4. Therefore, there is relatively strong correlation between this independent variable and dependent variable. For R squared is the proportion of the dependent variables variance that can be accounted for the independent variable. In this case, the value is 0.508, which means the independent variable explains 50.8% of the variability of the dependent variable, foreign direct investment. This is explained as this value is greater than 0.5, consider a moderate effect size and therefore effect enough to determine the relationship between FDI and inflation rate, exchange rate, and growth of domestic product. Additionally, the adjusted R square demonstrate whether or not regression model is improved by including more factor. A minimal difference between R square and adjusted R square must exist. This value is 0.467, which is far below than desired value of 0.508. Thus, this is not very favorable. From the result of the ANOVA table, the significance of model fit have been achieved with an observed F statistic of 12.393 with associated p-value of 0, which is lower than 0.05. In the majority of analyses, an alpha of 0.05 is used as the cutoff for significance. The p-value is less than 0.05. We reject the null hypothesis that there is no difference between the means. This indicates that the result was statistically significant among independent variable, thus have a relationship with the dependent variable. That means all the independent variables are significant variable to influence the FDI inflow in Malaysia. Based on the multiple regression equation, we can conclude that the inflation rate and GDP growth rate are positive correlation with inflow of FDI, as they show a positive value of beta coefficient while exchange rate show negative value of beta coefficient. In this case, we will determine the relationship between the independent variable with FDI by using p-value. Based on the coefficient table, show that the exchange rate were not significant in the model because the p-value is 0.914, which is greater than the level of significant alpha at 0.05. However, inflation rate and GDP growth rate were found to be significant with p-value which is 0.005 and 0.001 respectively at the same level of significance since their p-value is less than 0.05.
For the conclusion and recommendation, we have examined the relationship between FDI rate and exchange rate is very weak because it shows a negative correlation. and while other two is shown a positive variable, which is significant relationship between the variable and FDI rate. For the recommendation, instead of utilizing annual data, research might utilize monthly, quarterly, or semi-annually data. Next is strongly advised to replace any irrelevant variable with other pertinent factor from prior studies. And lastly, focus on or include various nations. This might result in different findings. Thank you.